Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Control the Network, Control the Universe. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items. We are recording this session, and we will make a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides available, and they'll be sent out in an email here in the next couple of days. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Nate Warfield. Nate is our Director of Threat Research here at Eclypsium. And he will be going ahead and presenting, and we will save a little time at the end for Q&A, but if you do have questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the Q&A chat box. At this time, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Nate.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to get started. This is a little different than some of the webinars we've done before. What you're getting is essentially what you would see at a hacker conference when I go, and I spoke at a HackCon in Oslo last month and presented pretty much this exact deck. So I hope this is a little bit more HackerCon for you and a good way to start your Tuesday morning. So I will just give a kind of quick rundown of what we're going to talk about. I'll do a quick introduction of who I am and what I do. I'm going to spend some time talking about how did we get to this point in network infrastructure attacks and the sort of landscape that we've seen in the last 24 to 36 months. We're going to cover I'm going to kind of go into details a bit about a few of the high profile exploits that have been used against network appliances in the last few years. And then we're going to get into some of the implant methodologies. We're going to talk about sort of the evolution of these implants and the ways that attackers have really been ramping up and stepping up their game in terms of like staying persistent on these devices and using them as essentially command and control, like hubs for lateral movement and stuff like that. Then I'm going to talk about some of the living off the land tools that these appliances come with, just built into the operating system, some of the ways that attackers abuse these to further burrow inside your network. I know that we've mentioned AI, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the uses that I've done to basically use large language models or ChatGPT to build tooling to run on network devices where I didn't have tools that I wanted to use myself. And then I'm going to spend a decent amount of time talking about detection techniques. And these are things that the idea is that these are things you can use in your environment, ways you can look at your appliances and start looking for either signs of attack or understanding what the device looks like when it hasn't been compromised so that you're better prepared to deal with it like post-breach and the inevitable happens. And then some takeaways. And as I always warn people at conferences, I'm not known for being super optimistic about the state of the landscape. So it'll be fun, but it's not necessarily going to leave you feeling good about the way that things are right now. So quick bio about me. So as Melissa said, I'm the Director of Threat Research at Intel here at Eclypsium. Former places I've been in my career, I worked for F5 Networks, which is a large appliance vendor, for about 10 years. I was at Microsoft, so I worked at Defender. I've been hacking and breaking networks for probably most of my career. I spent 18 years building them, about as long. And during that time, I was usually trying to figure out ways to hack them and secure them. I started CTI League back in 2020 with a couple other gentlemen. The focus of that group was actually sort of perimeter assessments, looking for vulnerable network appliances to try to prevent hospitals from being breached via that vector during the pandemic, as ransomware was really just starting to take off and become rampant at that point. I obviously do security research, and on social media, I use the handle N0x08, and this is a mid-pandemic photo of me. There's a couple of Viking quotes I had left in here from my time in Norway, so former owner of a Viking beard, and then a few of the conferences that I've presented different material at. So it's 2024. How is this new? And the fact of the matter is it's not. It's been, networks devices have been getting hacked for years, possibly decades. It's just that in the last about 4 or 5 years, the pace has just been accelerating extremely rapidly. In my belief, the reason on this, that it's been becoming such a rampant problem, is that operating system exploitation is very difficult, right? If we roll the clock back 20 years to 2002, 2004, Windows was an easy soft target, right? It was very, there was anybody who did IR back then or worked in systems administration back then had dealt with things like NIMDA, CodeRed, Slammer, like all of these, MS, 0869. There was all these vulnerabilities that came out that made the OS a really juicy target. Microsoft, like them or not, has spent billions, probably tens of billions of dollars making Windows as hard a target as possible. Arguably, Windows 11 is one of the most hardened desktop operating systems you can run. It's not a simple single exploit thing. Now it's things that have to be chained, multiple exploits to get from browser to system, so to speak. The other thing that's made this challenging for attackers is that there's been this multi-hundred-billion-dollar industry around security tools, right? We've got EDR, we've got XDR, we've got NDR, we've got insert a letter DR, that is basically sprung up around trying to detect attackers getting on systems, detect lateral movement. So it's a business for nation state actors and for cyber criminals, right? They're looking for the best return on their investment. And so in this day and age, the place to go is to move lower, move down into firmware, parts of the system that have been largely untouched by security hands for a decade, 2 decades or more, and things that are not visible to EDR, right? EDR is primarily your operating system, Windows. It doesn't do a great job looking at low-level firmware stuff, and there's Eclipsium is the only company that I know of that does anything on the actual firmware of network appliances. Phishing isn't as successful. It still works, right? But there's all of these things that we've built to try to make it harder for nation state actors and for cyber criminals. The other problem is that, like it or not, security research has become such a large industry and such a large business. All you have to do is go to GitHub. You can find all sorts of advanced tool sets. You can find command and control frameworks. You've got tools like Metasploit, Sliver, Mimikatz. There's all of these really advanced things that 20 years ago required a huge budget from the NSA to build something like this. Now you can just merely go to GitHub and grab a sort of a cornucopia of tools and assemble your tool set, and you save yourself a ton of time. And it also means that these techniques that once were the realm of just the nation states are now, your average script kiddie can use this stuff. Firmware and especially network appliances gives you a much higher dwell time. I probably will talk about a Mandiant report that pegged it at around 18 months of dwell time for network appliance, like initial compromise. And it gives you better access than most beachheads, right? If you compromise a VPN appliance, this device by its nature has to be internet exposed. This device is going to be connected to all of your internal networks because it's a VPN appliance, right? You need your devs to be able to get to the dev network, your finance people to the finance network. So it's a really nice place for attackers to set up shop. And now that they've figured it out, they're just starting to do it more and more, as is demonstrated by this slide we put together. This is not a comprehensive list of all of the attacks that we've seen against network appliances, but the idea is to give you a sense of just the cadence that's happening. Right. If we look back to 2005, this was a Black Hat talk where a researcher demonstrated he was able to build a rootkit for a Cisco router. Right. You start rolling the clock forward 10 years to Shadow Brokers in 2016. That was the group that dropped a bunch of, they were best known for their hit, the WannaCry vulnerability, but they had dropped a bunch of Cisco and Fortinet and other network appliance 0 days and backdoors that the NSA had built in the summer 2016. We roll the clock forward 4 more years to the beginning of the pandemic, and all of a sudden we're seeing Citrix, Pulse, F5. The Citrix vulnerability that's listed there is the one that actually that was the impetus behind starting CTI League. But in the summer of that year, F5 had another vulnerability that was exploited pretty widely. And we start to see nation states starting to pay attention to this stuff. Right. If we move forward a few more years to 2023, last year was the worst year on record for 0-day attacks, right? We've seen almost every single vendor out there had some sort of, almost every network vendor had 0 days being used against them. It's pretty obvious that the Chinese nation state actors have started buying devices and reverse engineering their code, reverse engineering their firmware, and figuring out 0-day vulnerabilities. They've started adopting techniques, including some that I presented in 2022 on basically backdooring the device configuration management systems to keep their malware resident and persist past reboots and upgrades. And we've seen that same sort of TTPs being used even this year in Avanti, where once again, it was a 0-day in a device that was found by Chinese actors, and a Mandiant report that came out a couple of weeks ago basically talked about how they had they had figured out ways to bypass not only their integrity checking tool, but they were using their device backup system to hide malware, to the point where I think Mandiant and even CISA said it's not, even if you reset this device, it's not necessarily guaranteed that it's can be considered safe. So this is the world we're in. It's only going to get worse. And what is the motives behind this? And this is purely my opinion, but it's fairly accurate opinion, I think, right? Every APT, and I do include the United States as an APT here because, we have the capabilities of this. Russia is interested in kinetic warfare, cyber components, right? We saw this with the Ukraine and the wipers they used against their satellite routers. China is kind of across the board. Espionage, they like to steal fighter jet plans from the United States. They have geopolitical tension things going on in Taiwan. North Korea, it's mostly money. Iran is mad because they can't get nukes. The United States, we kind of just do what we want, as we do. And then the ransomware groups, they're really just like money, fame, and power. They don't care about any of the, so much the geopolitical stuff. They're just in it to get rich. They like their leopard print Lamborghinis. And network infrastructure is the common vector that supports all of these missions, right? If you've got access to a VPN device, you can get into anybody's mailbox. You can steal, as we've seen with Volt Typhoon, stealing emails from the United States, or going into the infrastructure. Sorry, Volt Typhoon went after U.S. infrastructure in the Pacific, and then just recently, Microsoft has had the Russians in there on Office 365 looking at pulling emails and stealing source code. Access to a piece of network infrastructure enables pretty much all of these types of missions, right? It's much better than hacking into Patty and Accounting's desktop. So why is it worse now? So traditionally, and like I said, I was a network engineer for many years. Back in 2001-ish, when I started building networks, it was Cisco. Cisco was the shop, and Cisco IOS at the time was really the main network firmware that was out. And this was very proprietary. Old school network engineers remember you had a single binary file you put onto your Cisco router. During boot, this thing was unpacked into memory and it ran. It was hard to exploit because there was no open source components to it, right? You had to fully reverse engineer it. The functionality was not, other than the by design functionality was going to be undocumented. They weren't going to tell you any of the, it's not like now with appliances where they have to say, oh, we use Tomcat, we use Apache, we use these different open source licenses in our product. And it was hard to get persistence, right? There wasn't a lot of storage space on these things. I mean, a Cisco router usually had just enough storage space to hold the OS image and the text file that was the configuration. You fast forward to today, and every network appliance out there, and this also includes Cisco and Juniper and some of the big heavy iron stuff, they're running a full operating system, and most of them are running Linux. Citrix and Juniper run BSD, but it's an entire OS, and it's not just the parts of the OS that they need. It comes with a lot of the other pieces of the OS or that we include in a Linux distribution. So you've got Python libraries, you've got SMB libraries, possibly LDAP tools, like whatever functionality they need the device to do, right? If you need to say, I want this to support single sign-on against Active Directory, well, you install a Linux package that gives you LDAP support. So now you've got LDAP tools, you've got all of the things you need to talk to LDAP. And it's the same with, any other SMB or any of the other Windows protocols. Linux has done a great job of building interoperability. And so the vendors don't need to write this stuff. They can just pull this down, integrate it into their product, and you're good to go. There's a lot of third-party dependencies of this as a result, right? And this always introduces a supply chain risk of, fortunately, most of these vendors are running fairly old versions of Linux before we started to see a lot of the problems with package tampering, like we've seen with Node and these other things. But I mean, there is, when you're using an open source repository, there's always the chance somebody managed to sneak something in there. You don't have full control of your source code anymore, as they did previously, especially with say Cisco. And then of course the OSs, as I mentioned, they're not really supported by EDR vendors. The EDR vendors that do support it may support, hey, we support a Linux server. And while, say, an F5 or an Ivanti device is a Linux machine as well, essentially a Linux server, Those appliance vendors don't support you loading, say, like a CrowdStrike agent on their appliance, right? They either, in the case of Avanti, don't even have a shell, which you need to install some sort of an agent. Or in the case of F5, you can install it, but if it comes with weird kernel modules or different things, there's a non-zero chance you're going to cause some bad behavior on your appliance. And most network engineers, historically myself included, don't want to start running. It's challenging enough to keep these things running and passing traffic. And like on a good day, there's no reason you're going to make your life more miserable by adding somebody else's weird kernel module that's watching all system calls or something like that. And I'm going to place the blame mostly on the vendors here, right? This has become a problem as I've tried to do my research, and others have done research. These vendors have mostly made these things black boxes. They use ancient code, and I did a blog when Avanti's vulnerability came out back in January. Actually, I did the blog while I was in Norway, where I took apart one of their older firmware images, and I believe their Linux version was 10 or 11 years old. And Will Dorman here, he posted about the same one, right? We're seeing 14, 20-year-old versions of binaries on these things. And they just there's no real rationale. There's no need for them to, in their minds, to address this stuff, because that's not stuff that's being used, right? They're using a Linux version. They're adding a bunch of their functionality on top of it. So everything underneath doesn't really matter to them, right? In many cases, they will also restrict either the vendors have liked to restrict access to firmware, which is something that Fortinet has done, and a few other ones have done. They either restrict access to download it at all. They like to encrypt their firmware. Once again, Fortinet does this. I think Palo Alto does. And they like to take the shells away, which is, a Linux machine. We normally have a bash shell. They have kind of tried to copy the old Cisco model of, hey, an old school Cisco IOS had just this, what I call a restricted shell, which is it just gets you access to run the commands to configure the device and do the things that you're supposed to do. When you're talking about a machine that is essentially a full Linux server, you need the ability to do more things, right? Because while from the administrator standpoint, you've got this Linux server that you can only look around in a couple places. They've only given you, maybe they haven't even given you the ability to log in and look at the logs yourself. Maybe you have to use a web GUI, right? This is Avanti again. But from an attacker standpoint, I've got a CentOS machine that I'm attacking, and as soon as I can get my path traversal command injection, now I've got a shell. I can do whatever I want on a Linux. I'm on a Linux machine. I can drop my implants. I can do whatever. I've got shell access, but the administrator doesn't have shell access, right? The other thing that makes this that has challenged people is that unlike Windows, love it or hate it, Microsoft has done a very good job of making security patching just sort of second nature, right? 20 years ago, you had to wait for service packs. Now, every second Tuesday of every month, administrators just know, okay, it's Patch Tuesday. We're going to install patches. They've tried to make it as painless as possible for people to patch, 10,000, 100,000 machines within a span of a couple of weeks. Most organizations have patched at least a large, portion of their infrastructure. If you look at a network appliance, these devices were never really designed to be security patched, right? They didn't design this in mind. At the time they were building them, people weren't attacking them. So there was vulnerabilities. Everybody was going after Windows. There's a non-zero. We used to see this when I did network engineering at Microsoft. We'd install patches purely for functionality changes, right? We needed either new functionality or we needed bug fixes. Even in those instances, we had to go through certification processes because we'd find that the vendors would slip in behavioral changes, which, it's in their mind, maybe this isn't a big deal. But when you all of a sudden have low-level packet handling changing on a system that has 18 million connections through it at any given point in time, and you've got, 10 or 50 of these clusters that are all doing something like that, can cause things go sideways very quickly in network engineering. But really, the point I really have been trying to make is that there is no financial motivation for vendors to improve on the network appliance side. right? Microsoft benefited from the trustworthy computing memo, which was some memo that Bill Gates wrote. And he essentially said, we as a company will fail unless we can get our security under control, right? They looked at the landscape of how many Windows like vulnerabilities have been exploited, and he put a stake in the ground and said, we're going to change. And they turned that aircraft carrier of a company around security wise, right? It took years, sure, but they still did it. There is no most secure vendor here. There is so much vendor diversity between routers, switches, firewalls, load balancers, SSL devices, that no one person can say we're going to make security better and actually have a noticeable impact. And by and large, network infrastructure, people, it's there, it's already implemented. You can't just go and rip out your entire core network and try to put a different vendor in. And even if you could, who would you go to, right? They've all had a lot of problems. So let's get into some exploits. This is the kind of fun stuff. And yes, I kind of went crazy with Midjourney on this deck because Dune came out, and so enjoy the imagery. So this is an F5 CVE from 2022, and I used this one in the research that I did a couple of years ago talking about implanting load balancers and tampering with their config backups. This right here is a SSL. It does this. Their F5 sells you a device. They have one operating system image that you put on, or one firmware image, and then the functionality is unlocked by a license key. So this attack was going after the management interface, something that they like to say you're never supposed to expose it to the internet. In reality, people did. What this vulnerability was it's a header tampering vulnerability. And if we look in here, essentially what they did was they decided to have the front end of their management UI talk to another server on the inside via loopback address. And instead of it making sure that it needed to be authenticated, this thing essentially said, well, hey, if the host header says it's coming from loopback, then we have to assume that this is the actual, the server process talking to itself on a different, on a different port. Well, they figured out if you were just able to send a URL, send a request with a host header of 127.0.0.1, you could spoof this authorization token to be quite literally anything you wanted. And then one of these tokens in here, they essentially sent two header tokens with used with a comma, and that was a logic flaw that the F5 wasn't able to interpret. But the long and short of it is this would allow you to essentially run anything you wanted as root. It gave you full bash shell via a piece of Python code, and that was the end of the day. Now, when this one came out, people figured, okay, it did get widespread exploited. This POC came from Horizon 3, and I forget how long it took for them to drop it, but within hours, maybe a day, widespread exploitation was picked up. And I talked to some of my friends at Gray Noise, who monitors the internet for this type of stuff, and they were kind enough to send me a list of the payloads that they were seeing being sprayed across the internet. What was interesting is that most of what was getting sprayed was just very basic PHP backdoors, right? It was just web shells, things like that the idea was to maybe give someone some level of access later on. And then there was also Mirai. People were dropping Mirai binaries and things like that, but it was not super advanced. It was somewhat just I don't know, it was script kiddie in my opinion. But it was still, this was sort of the beginning of the end, if you will. If we look forward now to, this was I think February, March of 2023, Barracuda email security gateways. This was really interesting because this was actually not a vulnerability so much in the internals of the appliance. It wasn't the management interface. But what they figured out was that this email security gateway, which its job is to scan email attachments and make sure that you don't get hit by viruses, the code that scanned the email attachments had a vulnerability. So they were able to craft a malicious Office document, which when scanned got code execution, which then allowed them to take over this device. This was exploited as a 0-day, and it was the first time, and I say this with some confidence because I talked to the folks from Mandiant who did this IR, and they had not seen this before, of them using config backups to keep their malware resident, right? when Mandiant, I believe, dropped the first blog talking about zero-day exploitation of Barracuda devices. Barracuda was telling people that when you've been compromised, you need to RMA your device. You need to replace the full device, send it back to us. We'll give you a brand new, fresh one. They observed within a few hours of that blog coming out, Chinese actors got back into the devices and started modifying the malware that they were putting in there. And what they were doing was they were changing it so that it was going to stay in the backup system when people did your standard RMA process for a network appliance is take a config backup, power down the machine, send it back, put the new one in, drop the config backup back on, restore the config. So they realized they had this small window of time, days of time, really, when we're talking about a device replacement, to modify the malware and make sure that when somebody put their brand new Barracuda in place and turned it on, the malware came back, right? This was a very quick evolution of techniques from, PHP backdoors in the summer of 2022 to, backup config file resident malware in the winter of 2023. If we roll forward to I think this was like the late summer, early fall of 2023, Cisco IOS XE, which runs on switches and routers. This vulnerability was essentially you could get unauthenticated administrative access to the device. So you essentially got level like system 15, I believe, or privilege 15, access to a Cisco web interface, right? Once again, not supposed to be on the internet. Once again, people still do it. What was interesting about this one is that because of the way Cisco IOS works, this web file, or I should say the file that the actual vulnerability was in, the file system the vulnerability was in, is mounted read-only. So it's not a persistent storage. What we didn't see was actors immediately installing backdoors through the vuln. What they were doing was they were going in and using the vulnerability to create administrative users that they can log back in and then install a different implant in a more persistent part of the file system. So this was once again exploited as a zero-day. My belief was that this had been exploited for weeks, if not months, before anybody knew about it. Once people knew what to look for, once they understood, okay, this is the signature of what an exploited or a vulnerable device looks for, and then they started being able to pick up some of the implants that had been put in and say, okay, this is what an implanted device looked for. There was, I think there was the stats were somewhere around 50,000 devices that they discovered had been breached. So it's unlikely that they did that in a matter of days. This has probably been going on for a lot longer before then. Citrix Bleed, this was an interesting one. This one was probably the worst, the most egregiously patched thing I've seen. This was an SSL. It was a buffer overflow and an SSL VPN. All you had to do was send basically a get with 24,000 A's, and this would allow you to leak session tokens for the VPN appliance. What's interesting about this is because this is an SSL VPN appliance, and because people don't like to have to relog in every time they reboot their appliances or make all their users relog in, the sessions are stored on this thing. So the problem is that when they released the patch, they just said, hey, patch the device. That didn't actually fix it. If you had exploited the Citrix device before it had been patched, you could have gotten a bunch of session tokens from different users. Someone patches the device but doesn't reset the sessions, those tokens still work. And the problem was that Citrix, when they released the patch, didn't tell you, hey, you also need to reset all of your user sessions and make everybody log back in and do 2FA again. So, people would patch it, think they were secure. Actors could still come back through. This one bit Boeing, Comcast, which had been one of my ISPs years ago, sent me an email saying that they'd been hit. A bunch of mortgage companies got hit with this. And it was pretty egregious that they didn't say, I mean, this is something that the post command of resetting sessions could have been wrapped up into the patch, right? You'd just run the patch, have the patch run the two commands to reset sessions. It was easy. They could have fixed it really well. They completely dropped the ball on it. And then everybody else paid as a result. And then Avanti. Avanti has been fun. This one was a path traversal, which I thought had kind of gone away after 2020. But apparently not. This thing, another SSL VPN appliance, it would give you a root shell on the device. And what's interesting is that their initial mitigations were to try and block the paths that were being hit with the path traversal. This didn't work because actors are usually smarter than the patchers, and they figured out, well, if you can do things like URL encoding or things that make a basic, Apache like path exclusion, forget what it's called off the top of my head, but the thing that says you can't go to this path. If you can get it to get around that, you can bypass this. The same type of bypassing happened with F5 in 2020. CISA, for the first time, actually required that organizations unplug devices until they were patched. They basically said, if you have an Ivanti, you need to turn it off, disconnect it from the network, patch it, clean it, and then turn it back on and put it back on the network. The fun part here, and this was also in a blog that I'm sure Melissa will share. I took their firmware apart, and then I also took apart their integrity checking tool. The integrity checking tool is just a Python script, and this Python, it's a package file. So think of a tar file with a Python script and a bunch of text files, or their BOM files or bill of materials, which really just lists out file names and hashes that they should be if they haven't been tampered with. Right at the top of this script is a huge chunk of saying these are all the directories to exclude, including the /data partition, which is at least on my appliance in my lab, is like a 30 gig partition that's persistent across every version of the OS. And so we blogged about this at Eclipsium. Mandian talked about this a couple of weeks ago, saying, yes, that data partition is the place where actors have been basically dropping all their tool sets, because they know the ICT, if you run it manually, or Ivanti by default will run it every couple hours, it'll just completely it'll miss these. And there's actually, I'm not going to get into too much on this. The Mandian blogs about Ivanti are really interesting. If you want to watch sort of the evolution of attacker tradecraft on these things, I'd highly recommend them. I might even have them in the appendix here. So here's an interesting one too. These are the MITRE unforgivable vulnerabilities. This came out in 2007. So this is 17 years ago. These are the list of unforgivable vulnerabilities in things, right? And if we look here, so number one, a buffer overflow long strings of A's. We just saw that with Citrix bleed. XSS with script tags, SQL injection. So there's Eclipsium. We've disclosed vulnerabilities to a vendor that are still under CVD. So I'm not going to give you any details, but we have found this exact vulnerability at a company. Remote file inclusion. Pulse did this. One of the bypasses for their vulnerabilities, I think from Rapid7, used essentially just grabbed a file locally, and it was able to bypass the mitigations. Directory traversal. This was F5, Pulse, F5 from 2020, Pulse from 2019, Citrix from 2019, Ivanti from 2024. Direct request of admin scripts. We've seen this with F5. Grow your own crypto. Same vendor that we found the number 3 in also did this. Authenticated bypass using authenticated one cookie form. This is essentially what we saw with F5. And then hard-coded undocumented account passwords. We at Eclipsium found these with Megarack, SPX, the BMC stuff a couple of years ago. Not specifically a network appliance, but network management, firmware stuff. And then IoT vendors do this all the time. And I'm sure if we went deeper, we could probably find every single one of these vendor guilty of this. But this was just 17 years, and what have we learned, right? So implants. This is my favorite part, honestly, because I am of the opinion that we are at the precipice of watching sort of the arms race of network appliance implants, right? Now that attackers have really realized there's this whole landscape of devices that are highly privileged, that are internet exposed, that are hard to patch, hard to remove, mission critical. Oh, and they're all running Linux and BSD, right? It's the Wild West. They've overlooked these for a long time, and now they've realized, well, there's this huge landscape of things that we can go build implants for, right? We're going to start seeing, remember when Metasploit came out, people were like, oh my God, this thing is amazing. We can do all this crazy stuff that used to be really hard. That's where we're going to start seeing more and more attackers doing with appliances. So I kind of break these out into, so there's what I call non-persistent implants. They can't survive a reboot. These are things like you start up a reverse shell with Netcat, a basic Meterpreter payload or basic sliver payload that just runs in memory, where if the device reboots, it's gone, right? There's nothing that's actually written to the file system. Or if it is, like the case of Cisco, if you write something to a non-persistent storage, like something that's a memory file system, for example, where, it's only writable while it's running, and then when it reboots, it loads it from a memory image, or a disk image is mounted as a file system. Right. So these are fairly trivial. It's useful for an initial infection. It's not something that sticks around long, because you want to be able to get back in, and you want to be able to have some sort of stability to your implants. PHP web shells, like I said, this is what we saw a lot with F5 in 2022, also F5 in 2020. Super common first payload. The trick is you have to hope that the web server supports PHP. They also can be used as secondary payloads. The Mandiant reports, that I'll have it in the appendix, talks about a group that they initially called UNC 3540, UNC 3542. They have since attributed them to APT29 or Cozy Bear, but they were dropping PHP web shells as sort of a secondary way to get back into a system and restart their payloads. Their payloads weren't very well written. It's kind of funny. That was actually the impetus behind the research I did in 2022, is how can we do this better? And apparently I maybe got a little too into the weeds. Either way. And then sometimes actors will actually change the PHP configs. There's some of them, one of the vendors recently, they went in and they were actually modifying, I think it was Avanti, they were modifying PHP libraries, but it's very detectable, right? If you know what to look for, and I'll get to that here later on, if your device doesn't have PHP files as part of the web UI and you find one show up, that's a pretty good signal that there's something going wrong, right? Cred sniffers. This was something that happened with Citrix Bleed. They, once again, security research is an interesting game where we do this with the mindset of we're doing this to try to beat attackers to a technique, to help defenders prepare for a technique. The problem is that they do watch what we do. They do take some of what they take our research, and they use it to sort of shortcut their implants. So I talked about a way to implant pages on an F5 and how to modify their load balancing stuff. Well, they decided to change that and use it to implant JavaScript into the login pages of Citrix SSL portals. So what it would do was, as you when you logged in, it would basically just copy your credentials off and send them to some other server that was under their control. So then now they're sniffing creds, right? So I think I touched on it in the Echo Party talk I did, that this is a possibility. I didn't actually try it, but apparently they did. This may or may not be persistent, depends on where the GUI is located. If the web UI files are on a non-persistent storage, once again, they may get lost. Also, if the upgrade package modifies, like if you upgrade the device, maybe if it lays down a new login page that has the copyright date updated or something like that, there's a chance that this will get overwritten during a patch. And MFA should protect against most of these, because everybody's running MFA, I hope. Sliver C2, my personal favorite. I didn't realize that this would work as well as it does. It works on every load balance, every network appliance that I've been able to get a shell on, I can build a Sliver implant for. It's written in Go, so theoretically you could run this on, any CPU architecture, any operating system. And they also this got used in Avanti as well. So they started using I think it was a Rust payload, and the Rust payload was basically just to pull down the Sliver payload and get that to start up and run. It's like Metasploit in the sense that you can pivot through to machines in the back end. It has a nice little UI, as you can see here. It's probably something we'll see used more and more. The only thing that's tricky about this is the binaries are large, right? So when I did the research, I didn't implant the binary into the config backup system. I said, I put it somewhere else so that I could go and pull it down and store it somewhere else in the file system. The idea is, if you're taking config snapshots every night, which you hopefully are, if all of a sudden you see your config directory go from like 300K to 13 megabytes, like that should be a red flag of like, wow, why is the config folder 13 megs all of a sudden? What changed from yesterday to today? And then custom appliance malware. This is what we've seen a lot with Fortinet. The Chinese are really good at this. They built custom implants across multiple different Fortinet products. This is a Mandiant screenshot talking about them going after, I think it's 3 or 4 different products: FortiManager, FortiAnalyzer, FortiGate. yeah, at least 3 of their product lines they were building custom malware for. We've seen this with the Black Tech Cisco implants. Like I said, we saw this with Barracuda. The latest Mandiant article talks about some custom stuff built for Avanti. So that's kind of where the state of these things are. This is where I expect where we're going to see things go. So living off the land, living off the land is something we've probably heard a lot about in Windows and other operating systems. It's a thing for network appliances as well. All these machines are running open source software. Like, as I said, the vendors don't generally remove a lot of these built-in tools. So you've got things like FTP curl, you've got wget, you've got netcat, you've got SSH, you've got telnet. You can use LDAP tools for user enumeration, Python, Perl. You can use the built-in Linux systems of syscontrol, your init scripts, your RC local scripts. There's vendor-specific stuff that I found with F5 and Citrix that you can use to turn on implants, could go run scripts to download implants. It's essentially, if you go and look for lol bins for like Linux or BSD, most of those lol bins are probably going to exist on your appliances. Occasionally they take some of them out, but by and large, most appliance vendors just leave all of this stuff there. On the plus side, because it's so outdated, most of them are running things like Python 2. So it's a lot harder to get stuff like, say, responder.py or Impacket to work when you have an ancient 15-year-old version of Python, right? So this is the AI part, the llamas. So what I wanted to try doing, as I mentioned with Python 2, is that sometimes there's things I want to do on a device that I can't do with what it's got, right? In the case of this one here, I wanted to write a port scanner on an F5 and say, okay, I'd like to port scan the backend network behind the F5. Write me a port scanner, and I have to say, without using escape or Nmap. So what this thing does, it's very dirty, and the output isn't pretty like Nmap, but it works, right? The next thing I asked for it to do was, hey, write me a SMB connection brute forcer. And this, a lot of times it complains and says, well, Python 3 is no, or Python 2 isn't supported. Just tell it you have a legacy server that you can't upgrade, and it just plays along. This here, it wrote me essentially a brute forcing tool for SMB. So I could go try to brute force something on Windows Server in the back. And then this one here, I basically asked it to create what was this library? I wanted this to create a exfiltration tool so that because on a machine where I didn't have FTP or SCP or any of that stuff, I think this is very similar to what we use to exfiltrate the file system of the Avanti device, where I said I need to exfiltrate a whole file system. I don't have FTP or wget or any of these other things, so I just wrote a Python 2 script which just pulled all this stuff and sent it. Could I have written this myself? Sure. But the point is not so much that I could or couldn't. The point is that this makes the easy stuff even easier, and it allows attackers to put more time focusing on the hard stuff. And also, if you're looking for maybe a specific tool to be dropped or a specific thing to be there, this might be a way you can bypass them. But in the end of the day, stealth is not really all that much, isn't that really required. Most people don't detect these attackers on the appliance. They detect them doing other things. This is what happened with Avanti. They detected weird stuff happening on other systems, and then they tracked it back to the Avanti device, and that's how Velexity found it. The real thing is don't break traffic processing. With Barracuda, that thing started because the Barracuda device started bogging down. Someone called support and said, hey, my device seems like it's failing. Barracuda eventually figured out there's somebody hacked into this, and that's when Mandiant was engaged. If you don't break them, like Mandiant said, 12 to 18 to 24 months dwell time, because there is no real monitoring on these things. And I will say this not out of disrespect for my network engineering colleagues. Network engineers don't generally do security, right? Their job is highly complex, keeping the data, the packets must flow, but security isn't always something that's their bread and butter, right? So that can also pose its own set of challenges. They look at problems from this is a packet problem, this is a something broke problem, not necessarily this is an exploit, this is an incident in the making. So we'll get into some detection stuff here. I try to tell people you probably know these things better than you think, right? If you've done IR on a Linux or a BSD server, you can do this on most appliances. People get scared of these things because, well, it's a $60,000 machine that the network people don't want us to touch. Yeah, that's true. It is a $60,000 machine that the network engineers don't want you to touch. But That's the traffic side of things. The management side of things is just a Linux or a BSD system, right? You can look for stuff that you would see that would indicate badness on any other system, like say brute forcing, weird like shell processing. If you see like SH running as root for no reason, that's probably something that you want to take a look at. If the web UI suddenly crashes, if you're getting like, hopefully you're doing remote syslogging for these things. So if you see something strange, like Apache just restarted or like some database just restarted, that can be indicative of an attack in process. New users showing up, right? They are Linux servers. They are not multi-user systems. So if a new user is all of a sudden showing up on your your load balancer, that's probably not expected. You need to at least go look at it. And then weird connections to other systems. This is hard when we're talking about VPN appliances. It's easy when you're talking about something like, say, a load balancer, or if you see a connection initiating from one of these devices to your systems, that's not good, right? You may see a VPN connection may come through. Usually, those are at least somewhat trackable, right? You should be able to say, okay, this is a VPN user based on the egress pool. A lot of times these VPNs, you say, here's the egress pool of IPs I want my VPN connections to come from. If it's coming from the management interface of a network appliance going to, like, say, your domain controller, that's something where you'd want to go and start taking a look. Baselining your configs, right? I use the thumper as this is just the heartbeat of your device. You need to start figuring out what your machines look like in a normal day, when they're not been breached, or when you don't think they've been breached. Start looking at the configs, right? Where you can write scripts. You can have your script. You can have ChatGPT write them for you. Snapshot what this looks like. How many users are on the device? Like, what was how many bad logins? Grab your log files. Zip up the config directory and offload it someplace, right? Look at the file sizes and the folder sizes. Running processes is kind of tricky. These things are Linux machines. They can be somewhat noisy with different things running, but you should be looking at least at your firewall rules, and understand what normal looks like to these things. Like, what is a normal device profile for this network appliance? One of the things that I always encourage people to do is have your firewall set up so that the device itself cannot initiate connections out to the internet, right? Yes, these things have to be internet connected. You have to have this SSL VPN endpoint allow people to connect into it. You do not need to let that VPN device talk out to the internet on its own. If it's initiating a connection out to the internet, I can guarantee you nothing good is happening, right? If you can have it alert when you create new users, alert on process crash, as I mentioned. But just the problem here is that people don't, when something goes wrong and they go to do IR, they don't understand, like, well, what is this device and what does it normally look like on a good day? When you don't know what a good day looks like, you certainly aren't going to know what a bad day looks like. Device startup scripts. This is, like, I kind of touched on this. There's lots of ways that vendors will let you do either custom things to start. These screenshots up here are things that I used for my load balancing research, right? There was at least 4 different ways that an F5 let me run scripts on either state change, boot, log messages. This here was an implant that I built for NetScaler, where I created a fake process, a fake system process in the NetScaler. And so when it started back up, it would throw this one little error saying, hey, this process is not running, and then it would turn it on, right? So understand what a normal, like, even if it's just taking a list of this running system processes from like an LS of the directory, grab your startup scripts, grab your RC local, grab your cron tabs, make sure that you know what it should be booting up with, and then reboots. Obviously, don't assume that a reboot's always a stability thing. Go in and if you have a reboot of a device, at least do some semblance of an IR and say, hey, is this something, this is what happens with like things like, I believe BlackTech malware, where they put a backdoored iOS image on there and then they had to reboot into it, right? So that what may have been like, oh, weird, the device rebooted, you log in, well, everything seems okay, maybe not, right? And especially look for errors of things starting up, right? Attackers aren't perfect. I made a lot of mistakes trying to get these little shells to work, and my fiddling with it, that would have been detected if I'd been doing it on the device. And you'd be surprised how many we assume these attackers are super advanced. They're not. They're just people like us. They make mistakes all the time, right? The Mandiant, the one that they had to go in to keep restarting their malware, they just sort of like phoned it in and made it just good enough, except that it would crash all the time, right? That's something that could have been a signal. This is the thing that I think is really useful. Directory checksumming, right? So there is a way to understand what a directory looks like, the file contents, the file sizes. There's actually an updated version of this command that I can share if anybody wants it after the webinar. But what it does is essentially you can recursively list an entire directory structure on a system, and then what you're doing is you're SHA hashing the text output of this. This will immediately catch tricks like what I did with this script right here. This was my little loader script that I put on an F5 that was, I don't know, a couple of K if that. This thing was essentially impossible to detect because I could bury it like 30 directory levels deep inside their config directory structure, inside like hidden dot folders and stuff like that. A human is never going to be able to find this, not easily. But this command, if you run it, if I ran it on Friday and then I got hacked on Saturday and I ran it again on Sunday, the hash is going to change. And now if I'm seeing, the other trick is to save this output. So you can say, hey, well, there's some file just changed in this path, right? Timestamp change, size change, etc. You can automate this via cron. This is all stuff that you need to kind of plan and think about. And I'm happy to talk with folks about this offline as well. There's going to be false positives. There's going to be weird little gotchas, and there is no, like, the reason I can't make this, like, say, like a Git project that I put out for people is that it has to be tuned to your environment, right? But what I'm trying to share here is the techniques that you can use to do this stuff. This was the ICT bypass for Avanti. So this, like I said, I ran this. What I did was I hacked into the device we have in our lab. I went and I installed the Sliver C2 malware, or C2 framework, just to make sure that it was there. And then this is the screenshot of me running their integrity tool, right? Because I dropped it into the data partition and it doesn't catch it, right? So you have to understand the vendor tools have flaws, right? And obviously the Chinese actors that got into these things, they knew about these flaws and they exploited them, and they continue to exploit them. So some takeaways. I know I've kind of had to go through this fairly quickly. There's a lot of material, but really the takeaways is that it's going to get worse, unfortunately, right? This is not a problem that anybody has planned for, and it's not a problem that the vendors seem to be taking super seriously yet. Hopefully, it very well may take some level of, I hate to say government makes things better, but when policies get put in place, this was funnier in the EU when I pointed out that, hey, you guys managed to make everybody do what you wanted with GDPR. Maybe you can do it with network appliances too. That joke landed there. Most of us here in the US are like, oh God, GDPR. But the end of the day, if a government doesn't say you have to have a certain set of criteria before you can sell to major businesses, if there's not some policies, like if we think of PCI and all of the compliance things that happen with credit card processing and financial transactions and healthcare, that's the type of unfortunate regulation that might take before vendors have to fix this stuff, before they have to either make their platforms more open for people to do IR, make them more secure, to be able to prove that they don't have 25-year-old libraries of code running on a $60,000 piece of gear that they call secure, right? There's tons of 0 days waiting to be found out there. Every day, every couple of days, there's a new appliance with zero exploit being found. Some are really bad, some are not. I think I just saw one literally before this talk in a Kemp load balancer. Not a big popular vendor, but it's an unauthenticated command injection. Ransomware groups and APTs, they all do the same stuff. They're all going after the same devices. And at the end of the day, there isn't anybody more secure. I wish I could tell you just go to that vendor so I could buy a bunch of their stock, but that's not the case. But how can we raise the bar as in sort of the defensive thing? Understand the targeting, understand that they have super privileged access. People have heard assume breach. That was sort of our mantra at Microsoft, which is just assume that if you haven't been breached yet, it's going to happen. And try to cross-train. Have your networking and security people talk to each other, right? And understand that we're all on the same team here. that these are just Linux boxes, right? The network guys, they may not let you on your production gear, but most of these vendors let you get VMs. Go get a VM and spin up a virtual Citrix or a virtual Palo Alto. See what it looks like. See what the things you might have to do IR on look like before it's, you're on an incident call with all of your execs and your shareholders screaming at you, right? And then the really thing I would say is get leadership support for your patching, right? The part of the problem that these devices have is, like I said, unlike Patch Tuesday, where it's every second Tuesday of the month, these things don't get patched that often. And when it comes to 0 days in a network appliance, you've got hours, right? Your network teams need to be empowered that if they read the news Monday morning, they should be able to, if they see a new 0 day came out, they should be able to patch those things by lunchtime, right? You need to be able to somehow hit the big red button and short circuit this whole long tail of approvals and change control and all of that. That's something that's going to be an organizational procedural change, and maybe multi-vendors can be effective. At least, not all of your Fortinet get hit. They have to use more than one exploit. Yeah, that's about as good as it's going to get for now, folks. And I know I kind of went long, but if there's any questions, Melissa, now would be the time to ask.
Thanks, Nate. I don't see any questions that have surfaced yet, but again, I did want to reiterate, because the one that always shows up is, yes, we did record this, and we are going to make the slides and the recording available to anyone who's on here. So we will be sending those emails out soon. I know we are just about up against the hour, so I wanted to thank everyone again for joining us for today's presentation, and we hope to see you on the next webinar. Nate, again, thanks again for a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.